In a quiet suburban neighborhood, where everything seems peaceful, a single moment can shatter the illusion of safety. When a shot rings out, everything changes. A woman, with no prior history of violence, takes a gun and shoots a disabled man, claiming he was blocking her view. What seemed like an ordinary dispute turns into a life-altering event. The man, paralyzed and in a wheelchair, is not just an innocent bystander. He is a Paralympic athlete. His life is shaped by resilience, determination, and the constant fight to overcome barriers, but nothing could have prepared him for this. The woman responsible for the shooting, Karen, an HOA member known for her harsh demeanor, believes she is in the right. But soon, the truth of her actions will unfold in a way she never expected. As the story unravels, we will learn more about the complexities of the characters involved, including the protagonist, whose world is turned upside down by a single moment of irrationality. The conflict is not just about a senseless shooting, but about how far prejudice, entitlement, and ignorance can go and the devastating consequences that follow. Growing up, Michael always knew that life would present him with challenges. Born with a disability that left him paralyzed from the waist down, he was no stranger to adversity. From a young age, he learned how to navigate a world that wasn't designed with him in mind. But instead of letting his condition define him, Michael found strength in it. Sports became his escape, his passion, and eventually his calling. The journey to becoming a Paralympic athlete was not easy. It was paved with hours of grueling practice, physical therapy, and a relentless drive to prove to the world, and more importantly to himself, that he was capable of achieving greatness despite the odds. His wheelchair, once a symbol of limitation, transformed into a vessel of power as he competed at the highest level in track and field. But his success didn't come without a price. He faced criticism, doubt, and even the subtle judgment of people who couldn't fathom what someone with a disability could truly achieve. Yet, his spirit never wavered. He had a family that supported him, his mother who was his rock, and his father who had always believed in him, even when society didn't. The protagonist, Michael's father, had always been fiercely protective of his son. From the moment Michael was born, he vowed to shield him from the harsh realities of the world. His protective instincts were not born out of fear, but from love and an unwavering belief that no one, not even the world itself, should stand in the way of his son's dreams. He spent countless hours driving Michael to training sessions, ensuring he had everything he needed to succeed, and fighting to keep his son's spirit alive in a society that often seemed to be set against him. But despite all the love and support, he couldn't protect his son from the ugly reality that some people harbor prejudice, even in the most unexpected places. Karen, the HOA member who would become the antagonist in this story, had lived in the neighborhood for years. From the outside, she seemed like a typical middle-aged woman, someone who might blend into the background of suburban life. However, as the story unfolded, it became clear that her personality was anything but typical. Karen had always been outspoken and at times abrasive. She had a reputation for being difficult to deal with, often clashing with neighbors over trivial matters. It wasn't uncommon for her to be at the center of disputes, whether it was over parking spaces or property boundaries. She held the title of HOA president, a position she took very seriously, but her authority was often tainted by her overbearing and controlling nature. While many neighbors tolerated Karen's behavior, few dared to challenge her, choosing instead to stay out of her way. However, there was something darker beneath the surface of her interactions. Karen harbored a deep sense of entitlement and an alarming lack of empathy for others. She viewed her neighborhood as her domain, where her word was law. But even more troubling was her tendency to judge others based on surface-level impressions, especially when it came to those she perceived as different or inferior. Her interactions with Michael and his family had always been strained, though they hadn't escalated to anything severe until the day of the incident. The tension between the two families had been building for months, unnoticed by most of the community. Michael's family had recently made a few modifications to their driveway, which, while legally permitted, didn't sit well with Karen. She believed that the slight adjustment, though harmless, obstructed her view. It seemed like a minor issue until Karen's obsessive nature took over. She started to monitor the driveway closely, making snide comments about the wheelchair-bound son blocking her sight, though he had never parked in a way that actually caused any inconvenience. The situation simmered beneath the surface, with Karen frequently making passive-aggressive remarks to Michael's family, claiming that their carelessness was disrupting the tranquility of the neighborhood. For Michael, it was just another small hurdle to overcome. He had grown used to people misunderstanding him and making assumptions about his abilities. But for Karen, this was more than a minor inconvenience. It was a point of personal grievance. The woman who prided herself on maintaining control over her surroundings now felt challenged by a disabled man who, in her eyes, had no place occupying her space, whether physical or metaphorical. As the days passed, the tension between the families began to escalate. Karen, convinced that her space was being infringed upon, decided to take matters into her own hands. What had once been a small issue quickly turned into an obsession for her. She began to plan, fixating on Michael's presence in the neighborhood, seeing his wheelchair as a daily affront to her control. Meanwhile, Michael's family remained blissfully unaware of just how far Karen was willing to go to protect her view. The sense of impending danger grew stronger as the narrative moved forward. What had been a series of petty disputes suddenly felt more dangerous. The audience, slowly becoming aware of Karen's simmering resentment, starts to anticipate the inevitable confrontation. There is an air of uncertainty in the neighborhood, as though a storm was brewing, silent, unspoken, and waiting to explode. And when that moment arrived, it came without warning. Karen's frustration reached a boiling point, and the situation spiraled into something much darker and far more violent than anyone could have imagined. The truth of her intentions and the devastating consequences of her actions were about to unfold in a way no one in the neighborhood or Michael's family could ever have predicted. The fragile piece of suburban life shattered in a single, heart-stopping moment. The morning seemed like any other as Michael sat in his wheelchair outside his home, soaking up the fresh air before his training session. He had always found peace in these quiet moments, a brief respite from the demands of his rigorous Paralympic regimen. But that peace was shattered when Karen, the HOA president, stormed up the driveway. She had been eyeing him for days, her anger building over the seemingly harmless presence of his wheelchair in front of her house. Today, though, her irritation had reached its peak. Without warning, she shouted at him, demanding he move out of her view once again. Michael, unfazed, offered a polite response, trying to de-escalate the situation. But Karen wasn't listening. Her face flushed with rage, she stormed back toward her car, muttering threats under her breath. Before Michael could process what was happening, he heard the unmistakable click of a gun being cocked. He turned just in time to see Karen, standing a few yards away, aiming a handgun directly at him. "You're blocking my view," she screamed, her voice cracking with fury. Michael's heart raced, but he was frozen, unsure if he was hearing things right. The world seemed to slow as the seconds stretched into an eternity. The next thing he knew, a deafening shot rang out, shattering the stillness of the neighborhood. Time snapped back to reality as Michael felt the searing pain rip through his side, his body jerking violently from the impact. His wheelchair tipped over, sending him crashing to the ground. He could barely comprehend what was happening as blood pooled around him and the world around him blurred. Screams erupted from the few neighbors who had witnessed the scene, but Karen stood motionless, staring at him, her hand still gripping the gun. Panic spread like wildfire as chaos took hold. Michael's family, hearing the gunshot, rushed out of the house, only to find their worst nightmare unfolding before them. His father shouted in desperation, trying to reach him, while his mother knelt beside him, trembling, her voice barely a whisper as she called for help. But the damage had been done. Michael, the man who had fought so hard to overcome physical limitations, was now fighting for his life in a battle he had never anticipated. The neighborhood, once peaceful and ordinary, was now thrust into a frenzy of confusion and fear. As paramedics rushed to the scene, The weight of what had just transpired began to sink in. Karen, in a daze, was immediately taken into custody, but her blank expression spoke volumes of her disbelief at what she had done. For Michael, the shooting was not just an attack on his body, it was a life-altering moment that would change everything. His world, which had already been so carefully constructed around resilience and determination, had been shattered in an instant. From that moment on, nothing would ever be the same again. The shooting, seemingly a result of petty neighborhood tension, had opened a Pandora's box of legal battles, personal trauma, and a quest for justice that none of them could have predicted. The shock from the shooting reverberated through the entire neighborhood, but for Michael and his family, the real impact was just beginning. As Michael was rushed to the hospital, fighting for his life, his family was left in the aftermath of an event that seemed so senseless, yet was rooted in a dangerous mix of entitlement, anger, and ignorance. The initial moments after the shooting were filled with panic and disbelief, but once Michael stabilized, the questions began. How could something so horrific happen in such a seemingly peaceful community? How could Karen, someone they had known as just another neighbor, be capable of such violence? In the days following the incident, Michael's family was consumed with the emotional and physical toll of his injuries. The shooting had not only damaged his body, but also left deep psychological scars. His father, once a pillar of strength, found himself in an unfamiliar place, lost, struggling to come to terms with the brutal reality that his son had been targeted simply because of a misperception, a false belief that Michael's presence was an inconvenience. His mother, devastated by what had happened, oscillated between anger at Karen and fear for Michael's recovery. The neighborhood, once a quiet haven, was now filled with whispers and rumors. The shooting was the talk of the town, but it wasn't just about what had happened, it was about the person responsible. People who had once tolerated Karen's overbearing nature now questioned everything they thought they knew about her. Some of the neighbors expressed disbelief, unable to reconcile the woman they knew with the one who had pulled the trigger. Others, however, found themselves nodding in agreement with her actions, or at least sympathizing with her frustration over the minor inconvenience that Michael's wheelchair allegedly caused her. As the family rallied around Michael in the hospital, legal proceedings began. The police had already arrested Karen, but her actions had sparked a series of complications. The initial charges were clear: attempted murder, assault with a deadly weapon, but Karen's defense lawyer argued that she had acted in self-defense, that she feared Michael was a threat to her safety. The audacity of such a claim shocked everyone, especially considering Michael had not been armed, nor had he posed any physical threat to Karen. The idea that someone could shoot a disabled man for blocking a view felt not just absurd, but incomprehensible. But as the case moved forward, more troubling details emerged. Karen's behavior was revealed to be more than just a moment of frustration, it was a pattern. Neighbors came forward to report previous encounters with her, where her sense of entitlement and lack of empathy were apparent. She had been known to escalate small disagreements into major conflicts, often bullying people into submission. The HOA meetings, which she had run with an iron fist, were filled with tension and hostility. Karen's deep-rooted issues with control and her lack of consideration for others began to take center stage as the true motives behind her actions started to surface. Meanwhile, Michael's family was not just fighting for justice, they were fighting to heal. Michael's rehabilitation was slow and painful. His injuries had left him unable to perform basic tasks, and he now faced the daunting reality of a life that had suddenly become much harder to navigate. His training as an athlete, which had once been a source of pride and accomplishment, now felt like a distant memory. The shooting had taken away more than just his physical mobility. It had robbed him of the independence he had fought so hard to achieve. He was no longer the man who could push through barriers with sheer willpower. The loss was monumental, and his family struggled to find a way forward. In the midst of all this, Michael's identity as a Paralympic athlete became a point of contention. His achievements, which had once been celebrated, were now overshadowed by his victimization. The media's portrayal of the incident and the sensationalization of his disability caused him a great deal of emotional distress. The public saw him as a symbol of resilience, but what they didn't see was the man struggling to come to terms with his new reality. The pressure to be a hero, to represent something larger than himself, weighed heavily on him. As the legal case progressed, it became clear that Karen's actions had a much deeper impact than just the shooting. Her sense of entitlement and the way she perceived people with disabilities were now part of a broader societal issue that had been exposed. The story of the shooting, once confined to a small neighborhood, began to take on national significance. Disability rights activists rallied behind Michael, and his story became a symbol of the injustices faced by disabled individuals every day. The media, which had initially painted him as a victim, now began to focus on the broader implications of the case. But for Michael and his family, the legal battles and media attention felt like secondary concerns. What they cared about most was getting Michael the help he needed to heal physically and emotionally. The road ahead was uncertain, but one thing was clear: nothing would ever be the same again. The shooting had changed their lives in ways they couldn't yet fully comprehend. They had been thrust into a fight for justice that they never expected to be a part of, but they would fight it with everything they had, for Michael, for their family, and for the truth. The day of the trial arrived, and the courtroom was filled with tension. Michael's family sat in the front row, their faces a mixture of anticipation, anger, and hope. They had been through so much in the past few months, grappling with Michael's recovery, the media storm, and the emotional toll of reliving that fateful day. Now, they were about to face the woman who had changed their lives forever. Karen, sitting across from them in the defendant's chair, seemed oddly calm, her expression devoid of the fear or regret they had expected. She appeared more like someone attending a meeting, not a person who had committed a brutal act. The prosecution began its case, presenting the evidence of Karen's reckless behavior that led to the shooting. They played the 911 call, where Karen had told the dispatcher that Michael had blocked her view without any indication of self-defense or threat. The footage from security cameras that captured the moment she pulled the gun only added to the gravity of the situation. It was a clear shot of Karen walking away from Michael, returning with a gun, and firing it at point-blank range. There was no confusion, no ambiguity, just an act of cruelty. Michael's family watched as the images on the screen made their hearts sink. This wasn't just about the physical attack on their son, it was a deliberate and calculated choice to hurt someone who had done nothing but live his life. But when Karen took the stand, the courtroom fell silent. Her defense was shocking. She claimed that she had felt threatened by Michael, that she thought he was about to attack her. Her voice trembled with feigned emotion as she explained how she had been provoked by his presence. The jury listened intently, but there was no doubt in the room that Karen was manipulating the facts. She claimed she had been scared of Michael in his wheelchair, though the idea seemed absurd to anyone who had witnessed the events leading up to the shooting. The more she spoke, the more her story unraveled, and it became painfully clear to everyone present that Karen wasn't just defending herself, she was justifying a senseless act of violence. Michael's mother stood up to give her victim statement. She was shaking but resolute, her voice cutting through the courtroom like a knife. She spoke not only of the physical wounds her son had suffered, but also of the emotional toll it had taken on their family. She described how Michael's dreams, his future, had been shattered in an instant. She didn't just speak for Michael, she spoke for everyone who had ever been judged, marginalized, or harmed because of ignorance and hatred. Her words resonated with the jury, and the courtroom grew heavy with emotion as the gravity of the situation set in. Karen's actions were not just an isolated incident, they were a reflection of deeper issues in society, issues that needed to be addressed. As the defense tried to present character witnesses to support Karen, it became increasingly clear that her reputation in the community had been built on manipulation and control. The truth about her behavior, her tendency to escalate situations, her disregard for others, her lack of empathy, came to light. No one, not even the neighbors who had once tolerated her, could excuse her actions now. The pieces of Karen's character, once hidden beneath a facade of authority and power, were laid bare for everyone to see. The turning point in the trial came when Michael himself was called to testify. It was the first time he had spoken publicly about the shooting. His voice was steady but full of pain as he described what had happened that day. The shock, the fear, and the confusion. He explained how he had tried to de-escalate the situation, how he had simply been living his life, only to be attacked without warning. He spoke not just about the physical pain he endured, but about the emotional toll of living in a world where people could be so quick to judge and so willing to act on their prejudices. His testimony struck at the heart of the issue. This wasn't just about a woman shooting a disabled man. It was about the broader societal problems of prejudice, entitlement, and ignorance. As the jury deliberated, the weight of the case hung heavy on everyone. Karen had attempted to justify her actions, but it was clear to all who had witnessed the events that her claim of self-defense was nothing more than a weak excuse. Michael had been a victim, not just of the shooting, but of a mindset that dehumanized him and others like him. The trial wasn't just about determining Karen's guilt or innocence. It was about sending a message to society that such behavior would not be tolerated. The decision of the jury would set a precedent not only for Michael's case but for the treatment of disabled individuals everywhere. The moments leading up to the verdict were unbearable. Every second felt like an eternity as Michael's family waited for justice to be served. When the jury finally returned, the tension was palpable. The judge read the verdict aloud, guilty of attempted murder and assault with a deadly weapon. The courtroom erupted in a mixture of relief and vindication, but for Michael's family, the victory was bittersweet. They had won the battle for justice, but the scars left by the shooting would take much longer to heal. As Karen was escorted out of the courtroom, her face was a mask of disbelief. While Michael's family stood together, knowing that while they had achieved justice, the fight for a more inclusive, compassionate society was far from over. The climax of the trial had not just been about holding one individual accountable. It had been about standing up against the ignorance and hatred that threatened to divide them all. The days following the trial verdict were a blur of mixed emotions. On one hand, Michael's family finally felt a sense of justice. Karen had been held accountable for her actions, and the court had recognized the gravity of what she had done. But on the other hand, the weight of what had been lost still hung over them. Michael, though physically healing, was still grappling with the trauma. The emotional scars left by that day, the fear, the betrayal, the feeling of being targeted simply for existing, weren't so easily healed by a courtroom victory. His strength had been tested in ways he could never have imagined. His family, though relieved, couldn't shake the feeling that something had been broken that could never truly be fixed. As the media frenzy surrounding the case started to die down, Michael's family began to turn inward, focusing on his recovery and their own healing. The outpouring of support from disability rights groups, community members, and even strangers who had been following the case brought a glimmer of hope in the midst of their despair. They realized that Michael's story had resonated with so many people, people who understood the daily struggles of living with a disability, people who had fought battles of their own, and people who saw the injustice in what had happened. This collective support became a lifeline for the family. Michael's mother, in particular, found solace in connecting with other parents and advocates who had faced similar battles. It gave her a sense of purpose, a reason to continue fighting, not just for her son, but for others who had been wronged in the same way. Michael, though physically recovering, still struggled with his identity. He was no longer just a Paralympic athlete. He was the victim of an assault, a symbol of injustice. While the world viewed him as a hero for overcoming the odds, he was still trying to come to terms with who he was in this new chapter of his life. He had been stripped of his autonomy, and it was difficult to reconcile that with the man he had been before, the sense of powerlessness of being reduced to a victim was a heavy burden. His inner strength had been tested, and although he was determined to rise above it, the emotional scars ran deep. Karen's life, in contrast, seemed to unravel quickly after the verdict. The community that had once tolerated her was now filled with scorn and resentment. Many neighbors distanced themselves from her, and her once pristine reputation as an HOA leader crumbled. She had been exposed as not just a woman who had committed a violent act, but as someone who had been willing to destroy the life of a man simply because she felt entitled to a view. Her inability to accept responsibility for her actions only made her more despised. As the legal consequences continued to unfold, Karen faced both public backlash and legal ramifications. Her life, once filled with control and authority, was now filled with isolation and judgment. The very power she had wielded over others had crumbled, and she was left to face the consequences of her own ignorance and hatred. The story that had once seemed like an isolated neighborhood dispute had now become something much larger. Michael's case was a stark reminder of the societal issues that existed beneath the surface, the prejudice, the entitlement, and the disregard for people who were different. The battle for justice was far from over, but it had begun to spark a larger conversation about how society treats those with disabilities, how easily hatred can manifest, and how critical it is to challenge ignorance wherever it is found. In the end, while the legal victory was significant, it was the emotional and societal healing that would take the longest. Michael's family was still piecing together the fragments of their lives, but they had learned that healing wasn't just about moving on. It was about confronting the hurt, understanding the scars, and using their story to change the world around them. The battle for justice had been won, but the war against prejudice and ignorance was still very much ongoing. As the dust settled and the trial came to a close, Michael and his family found themselves at a crossroads, facing the long road ahead of recovery, both physical and emotional. The legal battle had ended, but the scars left by that single moment of violence would remain for a lifetime. Michael, though physically healing from his injuries, struggled with the emotional aftermath. The feeling of vulnerability, the betrayal, and the confusion about how someone could hate him simply for existing as he was, those wounds ran deep. But through it all, he found strength in his family and in the unwavering support of the disability rights community. Though the verdict had brought them a sense of justice, they knew the fight was far from over. It wasn't just about holding Karen accountable, it was about sparking a larger conversation about prejudice, entitlement, and the treatment of people with disabilities. Michael's story had reached far beyond the confines of his neighborhood. It had touched lives across the country and around the world. He had become a symbol not just of resilience in the face of adversity, but of the need for change in how society views and treats disabled individuals. For Michael's family, the journey had been one of transformation. They had witnessed the strength and courage of their son in ways they never expected. The same boy who had once dreamed of athletic glory now had to redefine his identity in the wake of unimaginable trauma. But in doing so, he became more than just an athlete. He became a voice for those who had been silenced by ignorance, a beacon for others who had suffered in silence. Michael had turned his pain into purpose, and in doing so, he had not only healed himself, but had sparked a movement that would continue to grow. Karen, on the other hand, was left to face the consequences of her actions. Her life, once dominated by control and power, had crumbled in an instant. The community that had once feared or avoided her now rejected her entirely. In her attempt to exert dominance, she had lost everything: her position, her reputation, and any semblance of respect. But perhaps the greatest loss she suffered was her inability to see the humanity in others, especially those she perceived as different. In the end, this wasn't just a story of a man shot in cold blood for no reason. It was a story of transformation, of a man who, despite the darkness he had been forced to endure, found a way to turn his pain into power, and of a community that was forced to confront its own prejudices. Michael's journey was one of resilience, but it was also a journey of education and awareness. His experience became a powerful reminder of how one person's actions, driven by ignorance, could change lives forever. But it was also a reminder that even in the face of unspeakable pain, there is always hope, there is always strength, and there is always the possibility of change. As Michael and his family moved forward, they carried with them not just the weight of their trauma, but the responsibility to ensure that no one else would have to endure what they had. They would continue to fight for justice, for awareness, and for a world where no one would ever again have to fear for their safety simply because they existed. If this story resonated with you, and you believe that everyone deserves to be treated with dignity and respect, then don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the HOA stories for more gripping, real-life tales that uncover the truth behind the headlines. Join our community of passionate viewers, and let's continue to raise awareness about the issues that matter most. Share your thoughts in the comments below. What would you have done in Michael's shoes? We'd love to hear from you. Stay tuned, because more powerful stories are coming your way, and together, we can make a difference. Subscribe now and be part of the conversation.